So in this session, we'll look at processes that you need in your quality organization and as obviously part of your QMS. So the questions we'll cover in this session are really what are the processes you need to follow, and really are they aligned with the needs of your customers and the end users? And we'll come on to into the next session. We'll lead into, are you using and effectively leveraging, the technology available to make sure those processes that you've designed are being executed as effectively and as efficiently as you can. Now, Deming famously said that if you can't describe what you're doing in a process, then really you don't know what you're doing. And certainly in certain industries, it's mandated that you have a defined process, and it's documented in terms of you have processes and procedures that are well defined that actually describe how you're going to manufacture the goods and services that you actually deliver to your end users. So really, this session is really about how things to consider when you starting to build an effective process. What do you need to consider in terms of the end customer needs, but also the needs of the users, the day-to-day users of the process within your quality system. Now, as I said, you will need your processes to be defined, and generally they're defined in documentation. In terms of documentation, if the procedure is very intricate and very complicated, and very complex and highly prescriptive in terms of the documentation, there is obviously the opportunity then for individuals to struggle to comply with this documentation. And there's also a danger that the individuals won't execute the procedure as you expect because there's simply too much information within the documentation. Conversely, if you have a process that's very poorly defined or more flexibly defined within documentation, there is the potential then for individuals to execute the procedure in different ways, and then essentially there's potential then to lose control of that procedure. So essentially, you really need to make sure that within the documentation that describes processes, you need to articulate to the individual that has to execute the process what they need to do and why they need to do it. So really, it's focusing on these two aspects within the documentation. So we're back to a very common slide. Again, it's a balance. It's a balance between these two extremes in terms of trying to control the environment completely versus letting it run free, and then you've got complete freedom to do things. And you as a leader have to define, the level of control you want and where on this spectrum you sit in terms of how well you define the procedures and the processes within your organization. So in designing processes, there's a number of aspects you really need to consider. One of them is process ownership, process output, process usability, and then the other final concept is really sort of process adherence, and we'll cover these each in turn. In terms of process ownership, you really need to define specific individuals with accountability and responsibility for maintaining documents and procedures. And most importantly, the individuals need to have quite intimate, explicit knowledge of the execution of the process in terms of they've executed or they need to execute it on a frequent basis. Really, you don't want the owner of those procedures and documentation to be really at the management level or the higher management level within the organization, because they're too far away from the actual real execution of the process to actually understand whether the procedure is beginning to actually sort of migrate away from actuality. And really, as a concept, quality as an organization should not be the owner of all of the documents within the QMS. And there are organizations where quality is not only the custodian of the QMS, they actually own the individual procedures within the whole of the QMS data set, and this really isn't appropriate. So really, talking about process ownership here, we're talking about individuals you can actually identify that really are sort of allocated documents and procedures, and it's their responsibility, and they're close enough to those processes to understand whether the documentation does actually reflect reality, and they are responsible for maintaining the documents and making sure these documents do keep up to current practice in terms of how the procedure is actually executed in reality. The same as process output in terms of the processes really have to be able to efficiently deliver value for the customers of the QMS. So we talked about the three customer groups: compliance, customer experience, business health. So really, if you've got a process within the QMS that's not satisfying, one if not all of those customer groups, then you really should question whether you should have that process or procedure within your documentation. So really, it goes back to, your customers are your reference points for the QMS. You should be constantly questioning, are your processes delivering value to these three customer groups, and how are they delivering value? Are they doing it effectively and efficiently in terms of their execution? Now, in terms of process output, we talked in previous sessions in terms of the inputs and outputs of processes, and various methodologies to reduce waste, to actually streamline processes, to make processes flow. So really, the process output really should be viewed through the lens of some of the best practice methodology in terms of how you design processes, in terms of reducing waste and making them efficient and effective. So again, it's back to using some of the methodology that's been used in manufacturing for many years very successfully within the context of the QMS. So things like Lean and Six Sigma, etc. So the next one is process usability. So basically, a compliant and a highly effective process is pretty useless if nobody will actually execute it and follow it. So really, you need to involve individuals who use the process during the design stage, in terms of designing the process, and also where the process interacts with other systems within the QMS. And again, don't always rely on the manager's perspective of reality. You need to involve individuals that will execute it, in as part of their day-to-day jobs. And the final one is really process adherence. So this is basically how often you can execute the process, that meets the expectations of the procedure. So as a generality, processes that are simple will be easier to follow, they'll be more compliant, and they will cost less to execute. So basically the message here is, if you can generate and create simple procedures and processes, you're going to go a long way in terms of meeting the compliance and cost expectations and ease of use in terms of executing those processes within your quality organizations. And as I said, we're gone are the days where you just need to write words on a page. There are lots of different ways you can actually get that information across, in terms of helping people to follow the process as you expect, the pictures and flowcharts and videos, etc., to get that information across to the end user, how to execute that process in line with the procedure and your expectations. And the most effective ways to get this across, again, is back to the training, basically making sure that individuals understand procedures and actually are able to execute them and demonstrate they understand and demonstrate their ability to execute them. And again, back to this concept of training with industry. Again, I would encourage you to use this framework, because it's simple. It focuses on basically, getting individuals up to speed in the shorter space of time. It focuses on learning by doing the activity, and there's this great aspect of, once an individual's trained and competent, they can start cascading that knowledge throughout your organization. So again, really look at your training frameworks, and does it meet sort of the expectations of the framework under TWI. And just to recap on training, in terms of, there needs to be to do with proportionality in terms of training. Not every change in a document requires extensive training and assessment, and we covered that in the last slide. And basically, anything that involves generation of material that it has the potential to impact the safety of the device or the product in the end user's hands, obviously individuals need to understand the how that process is executed, and demonstrate that after the training session. But in other cases, this isn't the case. You don't have to go through an extensive assessment procedure to check people have actually understood the training. And obviously in minor cases where documents are changing with minor edits, you basically need to ensure that the individuals have read the procedure and they actually are aware of the change. And really, again, you've got to be very pragmatic in deciding the level of training, and it's about how you apply risk management within your organizations, in terms of how you deliver training and assess training. Again, it's a great example of applying a very pragmatic risk management process and a risk assessment process within your organization. So really sort of, again, horses for courses, and decide how much training and how much assessment you really do need to cascade when you actually trying to describe processes and train people to actually execute them. And again, we covered this slide in the last session again, so don't forget some of the less technical areas in terms of training and some of the softer skills that are very important within the execution of your quality system and the role of your quality organization in terms of skill sets. So, report writing, project management, etc. So, don't lose sight of those in terms of bringing them into your training program. So in this section, we're going to just step through again the different levels of the maturity model, and we're going to look at process and just describe how representative organizations at each of these different levels, how they look, and what are the things they could do to move their organization through the different maturity stages. So an organisation sitting at the bottom in terms of unaware, very often their process management is very poor. Processes aren't designed around the needs of the end user or actually the end customer. And very often they're designed with a compliance focus in terms of meeting the regulations or standards. And very often they're designed by the quality organisation themselves with very little input from stakeholders. And very often there's no attempt to standardise good practice across different parts of the business. And very often it's impossible to compare same processes across different sites. So non-conformance and CAPA, they may have different systems and different procedures. So it's very difficult to actually compare apples with apples in terms of comparing two sites. And very often a company sitting at this base level sees the quality system as sort of solid and basically unchanging, and your individuals are unable to actually make any changes and improve and change the documentation to better reflect the processes that are actually being executed. And when you look at the documentation, very often there's very little use of diagrams to help the end user execute the process, and generally the documents are only reviewed for errors when they become updated, if at all. And very often there's a danger that the documentation starts diverging from reality, and this is obviously a business and a compliance risk. And in terms of availability of the procedures, very often the documents are actually not available where the actual procedure is executed. So this obviously is a risk. So basically they're not readily available where they're actually where they're actually needed. So really, a score at this level, the business is facing quite significant compliance risk and operational inefficiencies, really due to the lack of process alignment with end users. And in terms of, it needs to better understand what the end users' needs are in terms of the process, in order to sort of better design processes and procedures that actually fulfill those expectations. So to move through the maturity level to the next level, really, an organisation has to start looking at the processes through multiple customers' eyes. So we talked about the three customers earlier, and really seek inputs from multiple perspectives during the design and obviously the improvement of processes, and begin to look to standardise processes across different areas and to actually allow comparison between areas, but also obviously leverage best practice in terms of how activities are performed within the quality organisation. Now, the next level is basically very, very similar in terms of the process management's poor. Still not a lot of the design around the end user's needs and the customer's needs, but generally the organisation at this level is becoming aware of it. That generally procedures and documentation is designed by quality with limited input from end users, but they're beginning to get some degree of knowledge in terms of the requirement to standardise, but it's still very difficult to compare different sites. And basically changes to documents really happen when there's a critical mass of individuals complain about them. But generally when that doesn't happen, the processes are taken as given, and they don't really go through any updates. You're beginning to get an understanding there is actually there are better ways of actually describing processes other than just through words in terms of the use of graphical content. Procedures can be printed in the areas where they're needed, so the documentation is beginning to be closer to where it's actually needed. But it's not unusual that the current version being used is not the latest update. So very often there's a delink between the execution of the activity and what is the most current effective document. And really, the score at this level, again, the business is under a degree of risk in terms of compliance and operational efficiencies. However, the organisation is beginning to understand these gaps and is beginning to start to address them. So again, to move to the next level, really you need to sort of broaden the customer's perspectives in terms of process design, and you really start to formalize the requirements to seek and involve other stakeholders doing process design. So it's done as a less of a ad hoc sort of a way of doing it, and there's more rigor in terms of when you design a process. These are the functions you need to actually involve, and also leveraging best practice in terms of taking a standard process and cascading it across different sites in terms of this is the best way of doing it. Use this as the sort of the vanilla model, and then build on that as the best way of executing a process or a procedure. Now, an organisation at learning, basically, they are becoming very effective of process design and process management. Basically, there's a lot of input from end users and stakeholders to standardise against the core model, and there's lots of input from the end users in terms of does it meet their requirements, but also the end users of the quality system in terms of those three customer groups. There's a degree of local variation is permitted, but in general, you can compare across different sites. And when you look into the documentation, there's better use of graphical ways of actually explaining the procedure, and very often the documentation is readily available where it's needed, and does go through some degree of periodic update in terms of applicability. So basically, the documentation fits the organisation far better in terms of describing the process that needs to be executed, but also making sure that it's improved and it's maintained. So a company moving on to mastery really has got sort of multifunctional, dimension to how processes are actually designed and actually how they're improved in terms of there's a real understanding, there's a shared ownership of the QMS, and there are ways of actually making sure all those different customer inputs are actually sought in terms of when processes are actually created, but also when they're improved in terms of So an organisation centred at mastery really has a very holistic way of how it approaches process design and improvement, and it involves many functions in terms of their inputs. And there's basically a shared ownership of the quality system in terms of the shared ownership of documents in terms of input in terms of process design, with the different requirements of those different user groups being listened to and incorporated into the process, and obviously the documentation that actually describes the process. So a company sitting at mastery really is knocking the ball out of the park. Really, their process management is very, very good. During the design, there's multiple inputs in terms of how processes and procedures are designed. There's a formal process. Very often, processes are standardized against a core model, but they allow some sort of degree of local flexibility and variation when that's needed. Processes don't tend to be standardized just for standardization's sake. When you look at the documentation, it's very clear, it's very simple. It contains a lot of rich text in terms of lots of rich media in terms of like videos and flowcharts and pictures to describe the process. The documentation continually goes through a degree of review to check that it does actually reflect reality in terms of how the process is executed, and material that's redundant is continually being removed to really sort of focus the documentation in terms of is it describing the process that needs to be executed well, and is it helping the individual do that, and does it articulate why it's important in terms of the different stages of the process. And in terms of continuous improvement, there's a real expectation that the documentation can continually be improved, and processes are looked through the eyes of the ability of the organisation to change them and make them better in terms of their ability to deliver value to the three customer groups. So in the next session, we look at technology in terms of there's obviously a close link between technology and process, and we'll basically discuss how the growing technological advances are really helping organizations in terms of how they handle information, how they handle data, and also how they execute processes and make it less error prone and more efficient for the end customer.